Just hours away from a big election right here in Houston. And while many of our viewers tonight aren't worrying about going to the polls tomorrow, we're only a year away from picking a new president or keeping the old one. And you better be ready to get out and let your voice be heard. During the 2016 presidential election, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and other minorities accounted for only 26.7% of voters, meaning 73.3% of voters were white. That's a lot of people from one race deciding what happens for all of us in this country. So what is the holdup? Where is the disconnect between minority voters and actual voting action? Now, some would say the system is rigged against us. Election day is always on a weekday. Not so easy for everyone to miss work to cast their vote. Then there's the rolling back of the Voting Rights Act, which requires you to have a specific form of ID. Last year in Georgia, Secretary of State Brian Kemp improperly purged more than 340,000 voters from the state's registration rolls. 70% of those voters were black. Here to talk about the importance of minority vote is Mary Moreno from the Texas Organizing Project, political strategist Damon Jones, and from the Center for Critical Race Studies at the University of Houston downtown, Dr. Vita Robinson. We want to welcome you all to the Factor Uncensored. When we look at these dismal numbers when it comes to minorities participating in the election process, where do we see the problem?
Right now, I think it is a lot of the barriers that you mentioned, right? But it's also that nobody has gone to their door and engaged them directly. And that's what we're doing every election cycle. And when we do that, people do vote. When we ask them, what do you care about? What is impacting your community, right? Because they have to be able to see that their vote is going to make a difference, right? So they talk about flooding. We can connect it to the ballot box. If they talk about trash pickup, right? All of these issues that are very important to people's daily lives, we make a connection to the ballot box and people do respond.
Now, Damon, let's look at the process that she is talking about, going door to door. Shouldn't we be adults now where we don't have to go to someone's door to get them to vote on what's best for them and their future?
Well, I mean, that's a great point, but I'd also say you have to engage folks. If you want folks to be fully informed, if you want my vote, you got to ask for it, right? And adults should go out and cast their vote and make their voices heard, but let's spend the money to engage folk. Let's spend the money to go to the churches. Let's make sure that we are hiring African-American consultants to go speak the languages of the voters that they want to engage. But as Mary, I can't stress that enough. We have to go ask for that vote, and I think that's not happening across the board.
For those who don't want minorities voting, do they count on the lack of engagement? Dr. Robinson.
Of course. The lack of engagement is fully recognized in our political system. Our voting system, our electoral college, was primarily based on the idea that a particular portion of our community was intended to be the voters. As you mentioned, 73% of the last voters in the last election were all white. However, only 66% of eligible voters are white, which means that a large proportion of African Americans and Latino and Asian American voters were not engaged properly. They were not a part of the political process. They were, of course, victims to this strategized, this legalistic system that was intended to continue to suppress them in order for white supremacy and dominance to reign in our political system.
Go ahead, Damien.
Yeah, and to that particular point, the numbers have shown us from the early voting tally that 28% of African Americans have come out to vote. But I also think that African Americans, Latinos, whites as well, maybe have been turned off a bit by the negative ads that they've seen barraging our televisions, and maybe we just don't want to be a part of this foolishness, right? And so I think maybe that's also deterring folks just a bit.
What excites people at the polls, particularly minorities? There's not a Barack Obama running, so no one is running and rushing to the polls. So what are some of the other issues that would get minorities up to vote?
Well, a lot of them do care about their families, right? They're engaged right now in survival. A lot of people who are not voting, right? They work long hours. They care about the kids. So when a candidate, for example, like this weekend I was walking with Tarsha Jackson, who's running for City Council District B. When a candidate shows up and it's like, I care about your family so much that I'm here to talk to you. And I'm going to fight with you for your family. That really does spark something in people. So I think like that direct engagement from the candidates and from other people telling them like, I see your struggle, I see what you're up against, and I'm going to help you, I want to fight with you, that message really resonates.
And Dr. Robertson, let's go from the historical perspective when it comes to voting. What are some of the roadblocks out there besides the ones that we mentioned already, and how do we cross that obstacle?
Well, first of all, I would easily identify fear and intimidation are one of the primary tactics that
that would look like what in 2019?
Well, in 2019, it's ID card requirements for voting. It will be police presence at voting polls. It's going to look like very strong and racist rhetoric being perpetuated on television. That fear and intimidation are one of the primary means. Equally so, as you mentioned, by switching both the voting days and the voting spaces, we are creating confusion. And because of the policies that we've put in place for our elections, if one reports to a polling place that one is not registered at, then that vote goes into hold, right? It's a provisionary ballot until it is validated. All of these kinds of tactics are subtly intended to ensure that the people who are not as economically stable, not as socially empowered, not as economically equipped are disenfranchised from the election process.
And Damian, really quick before we lose in the last 30 seconds, the disappearance of the straight party ticket, where you can vote for either Republican or Democrat straight down the lines. Will that turn people off here in Texas?
No, I don't think it'll turn it off, folks off at all. I think it puts the onus on the candidate to stand on their own merit and not ride the coattail of the party and the work of others. Folks really have to go door to door and really speak to who they are. They really have to speak to their track record, and if they don't have one in minority communities, then it will show up and voters will make that decision based on the lack of a track record and the work that they have done in the community.